Good evening and welcome to the Oxford Writers' House discussion on writing fantasy. My name is April, and I'm the founder and director of the Oxford Writers' House. We support young authors and creative efforts across Oxfordshire. We're here in the Sheldonian Theatre tonight, at the heart of the University of Oxford, to learn about the process that has gone into the greatest fantasy authorship of our time. Tonight marks the first time that Oxford has hosted George R.R. Martin, who journalists have deemed our generation's Tolkien, a man whose imagination and literary prowess have gained him an unrivaled international fan base. We should have also been joined tonight by Sir Philip Pullman, whose best-selling fiction is loved both locally and throughout the world. Sir Philip has been a luminary figurehead and staunch supporter of literacy and creativity in Oxford for many years. Last night, I received an urgent correspondence from Sir Philip stating that he is exceptionally unwell and unable to join us. We are so grateful to him for his ongoing support of the Writers' House. He sends his deepest regrets and will hopefully be joining us in the near future, pending his recovery. As the director of the Oxford Writers' House, I'm honored to be reopening tonight, supported by these two tremendous masters of the arts. We're also very grateful to you, our guests, for being here. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones as we are recording this conversation. We're going to start our conversation tonight with questions that have been sent in from our international fans and then turn the floor to you, our audience. Please do not be shy. We know this is a big venue, but we want to hear from you and to engage with your ideas. Our discussion tonight is chaired by Professor Carolyn Larrington, who has recently retired as Professor of Medieval European Literature here at the university. She is an acknowledged expert in Old Norse literature, and she writes extensively on medievalist fantasy. She is a co-founder with Stuart Lee of the Oxford Center for Fantasy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, April, and welcome everybody. I've got a list of interesting questions which have been sent in via the internet from some of the people at the Oxford Writing House and a couple of my very own. But I'm going to start with a question that comes from Gabriel Henker in Brazil, who asks, how do you handle the intersection of science and magic in your writing, particularly in terms of maintaining a coherent and believable world?
Well, I've been writing and reading imaginative literature since I was a kid. I started out reading comic books and went into science fiction. When I was young in the 50s and 60s, science fiction was far more popular than fantasy. Tolkien hadn't quite made his mark yet. And so I read a lot of science fiction. I read horror and I read fantasy. And I never really saw a huge distinction between them. They all seem to do the same thing to me. There are some people in the field, particularly science fiction writers, oddly enough, who sort of thought that science fiction was much more respectable than fantasy, because science fiction is about things that might actually happen. Yeah, right, like hyperspace. And fantasy was about impossible things. I never bought that distinction. I think they're both branches of imaginative literature. But I do think it's necessary, whether you're writing science fiction or fantasy, to try to keep it believable on some levels. And I wrote, the early parts of my career in the 70s and early 80s. I was writing mostly science fiction. But when I did write a fantasy story, I tried to think about the magic to make it reasonable, to make the world reasonable. And Tolkien, your own J.R. Tolkien, who thrived here at Oxford, in many ways was my model on this. I mean, if you look at Lord of the Rings, if you study it as I did, yes, there's magic there. There's these magic rings, and there's various other types of magic, the Palantir and the Seeing Stones, but it's really relatively low magic. Even Gandalf, who's a wizard, when the enemy attacks, he doesn't just go gobble gobble and they all turn into birds or something like that. He fights them with his sword. There's a groundedness to the fantasy. Tolkien makes it seem believable. And I set out to do the same thing with my Game of Thrones and its sequels. One thing that I've gotten a little bit of controversy in lately is my insistence that dragons only have 2 legs. These 4-legged dragons are a creation of medieval heralds who had never seen a dragon because they don't exist. And they decide dragons have 4 legs and wyverns only have 2 legs. And people constantly correct me on that, and of course they're wrong. The point is, in Westeros, we do have dragons. So why would anyone put a 4-legged dragon on a shield? You just have to go out and see the real dragon and count the legs. 1, 2. That's all you need.
Plus the wings.
That's right. Plus the wings, yes.
Yeah.
And I checked with Neil deGrasse Tyson, a very famous science fiction writer, and yes, there are no 6-legged animals, 6-limbed animals on the face of the earth. So I went for the more realistic thing. Now it's harder when you're talking about dreams and you're talking about other types of magic. How do you handle it? Well, it's tough. It's not easy. People have sometimes asked me which is the easiest character to write in my series, which is the hardest character to write. The easiest for me has always been Tyrion Lannister because, I don't know, he's fun to write. He's a smart ass. He gets into very dramatic situations. The hardest to write is Bran Stark, who is the character who is most involved in the magical side of it. And I have to be, he's also the youngest character, it's also hard to write from the viewpoint of an 8-year-old, because I'm actually a little older than that. And you have to think what he would know, what he would not know, what he would understand, what he would misinterpret. But then there's the magic, and how do you handle the magic? All I can say is it's something that does require a lot of thought.
And that makes me want to jump in. I'm going to sneak my question further up the agenda here, which is, do you figure out the rules for magic before you start writing? Or do you just start writing and then make the magical thing do something and then say, no, wait a minute, in my world, it can't do that? And something I was always a bit worried about watching the show was dragons and water.
Well, yes.
I mean, when they dive down fishing, isn't that a bit risky? Wouldn't they go out?
Well, I don't think a dragon would go underwater for very long. They don't have gills, and they need, they're creatures of fire. They need air. They need oxygen to kindle their fires.
What keeps it going? Yeah.
Yeah, but there are a lot of fantasy writers today who work out their magic very methodically, and reviewers praise them for it, and they're very proud. I worked out an original magical system, and here are the rules of my magical system. And but I've never done that, because it seems to me that if you have a magical system, you don't have magic, you have fake science. If every time you put the eye of a newt and the wing of a bat or something, and a dead man's toenail in a pot, you get the same thing. That's fake science. It's something anyone can learn, and they can do it. Real magic, if you look at, not real magic, but what passed for magic in the real world was unpredictable. They didn't know, you draw this on the floor and you'll get a demon from hell. But, the demon from hell shows up and you drew it wrong. I'm going to eat you now. Things like that. Magic should be dangerous. It should be unpredictable. It should be something we don't understand. It's not just fake science. At least that's the way I handle it. But it does slow me down a little thinking about all of these particular things. Prophecy is something the same. I play with the prophecy, as many other people do beforehand, foretellings and all that. And magic, like prophecy, should be a little unpredictable. You can't have a prophecy that just comes true the way it's written and everybody understands it. It has to come true in some way you didn't understand. So it, pardon my French, bites you on the ass. And that's the way we see prophecy in, in real history, in real life. Like there was the Word of Roses, one of the stories. There was a particular noble in the Word of Roses who'd been told that he had to stay away from a particular castle. He would die at Umpty-Ump Castle. I'm sorry, I forget which castle. But he never came near that castle. He spent his whole life avoiding that castle. And then in the battle, I think it was First St. Albans or something, he was killed in front of a pub that had that castle on the sign.
Oh,
so that's what you want. You want that kind of twisting, but it doesn't always come easy.
Okay, can I move on to another question from Gabriel, and that's about adapting your work for stage and screen. What were the biggest challenges, he says, and did you say no to any decisions, surely?
Well...
How long have you got?
Yeah, this is a very complicated question. Adaptations, I recently had a blog about adaptations, and it's tricky. I mean, you're talking to different industries, and in television and feature films and stage plays, a lot of other people involved, including a lot of other writers. Now, you can do the adaptation yourself if they'll let you, and that way you control it. But if not, you're turning over your baby to someone else, and they're writing it. Now, above them, of course, are whoever you're producing. Is it Paramount Studios or 20th Century Fox? Is it HBO or CBS? They're going to give you notes, and they're going to decide, how they want it, how they do it. I do think, as I said in this blog post that I made a month or two ago, that there's not enough faithful adaptations, because they don't buy the book that did terribly and no one liked. They buy classics. They buy books that are centuries old and that people loved, or they buy the latest bestseller that has hundreds of fans. And then they turn it over to a screenwriter and director who often come in with their own ideas. And, there's a few phrases in Hollywood that you want the screenwriter to feel he's free to make it his own. And too many screenwriters do make it their own, even if they're adapting Dickens or Tolkien or Shakespeare or whoever you want, they decide to make it their own. But they never make it better, because usually the people who are making it their own are simply not as good as the people who wrote it in the first place. Of course, you do have issues. This is a long thing. I mean, we could talk for an hour about just this issue here. One thing that's very big right now is the whole issue about outdated attitudes, racism or sexism or classism or things like that writers of the past may have had. You're seeing this even in books right now. The James Bond books by Ian Fleming are being re-edited, and a lot of Ian Fleming's attitudes are being taken out, and Roald Dahl, even more so, his books have been censored and are being improved, which is particularly offensive in the case of Dahl, because Dahl, when he was alive, said to his editors, "Don't touch a word of my stuff." And now he's dead, of course, so what he said doesn't matter, and they're changing the words. They're making it, more for a modern audience, less offensive or something like that. And I gave a longer speech about that in New Mexico some time ago, but some of the changes are just ridiculous. They eliminated the word fat because it would be offensive to fat people, and I've struggled with my weight all my life here, and believe me, they've substituted the word enormous, which I don't think is an improvement. Leave it the way Dahl wrote it, and just put, if you want to say this book was written in 1952 and reflects the attitudes, that should do it. You don't have to change the actual text. And it becomes even more heated when you're doing adaptations of something for television or film. You're not just republishing the book. You're doing it. Now there are challenges to adaptation that are actual challenges of the form. I mean, when you're doing a book, as seen from my books, there are these enormous swirling things that are, sprawling things rather, that are bigger than, I mean, any one of my Ice and Fire books is bigger than all three of Tolkien's volumes put together. There's a lot of stuff there. What's the budget going to be for the TV show? What's the how many hours are you going to have? You're going to have 10 episodes? You're going to have a series of 3 movies? It's a pity. I was really looking forward to meeting Philip Pullman and also hearing his views on adaptation, because he's had an interesting history. They first made The Golden Compass as a feature film, and it did not do very well, and they didn't make the rest of the series, which is, of course, a nightmare for any writer. They start making a series and they don't finish it. But then they came back a few years later, and more recently they've done it as a television miniseries, which I think was much more successful. But it would have been interesting to hear what Mr. Pullman thought of that. But I first got involved in television in the mid-'80s. I was hired, before that, I'd been, an actor, professional writer for like 15 years, but I'd just written short stories and novels. But I was hired on the revival of The Twilight Zone, which was on CBS, not the original Rod Serling Twilight Zone, by the way. I am old, but not that old. That was on when I was in grade school. But we were reviving it in the mid-'80s. And I got the opportunity to write some scripts for it. And since I'd never written screenplays or teleplays before, I said I will adapt stories rather than that, so I can concentrate on learning the form without having to come up with a story. And the first thing I adapted was a story by Roger Zelazny, great science fiction fantasy writer, and also a dear friend of mine, sort of a mentor to me. We both lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And he had written a story called The Last Defender of Camelot, which had Sir Lancelot doesn't die, he lives to the modern day, and then one day Merlin is waking up and draws Lancelot to him, and they have a conflict, etc. It's a great story. It was nominated for some awards and all that. And I learned on that first, Roger was my friend, and I loved this story, so I didn't want to mess it up. I wanted to change it as little as possible and do something Roger would be proud of. Fortunately, I had Roger's phone number, so every time a change come up, I could actually call him and say, Roger, this issue has come up, how do you feel? To my mind, on that very first thing, I experienced both what I consider a legitimate change and an illegitimate change. The climax of the story takes place when Lancelot is battling an enchanted suit of armor called the Hollow Knight, and they're battling it in like an other dimensional Stonehenge. So, and in the story, they're mounted on horses, and they charge each other, and they're fighting among the stones, and etc. So I wrote it faithful to Roger's story the first way. And then our line producer, who's the guy in charge of making the physical production, he comes to me. He says, George, we looked at your thing here, and you can have horses, or you can have Stonehenge, but you can't have horses and Stonehenge. If we go to we need horses, we got to go outdoors, we got to go on location, and the stones are made of paper mache, they'll blow right over. Can't do it there. And so I called up Roger. I said, Roger, they're making me change something. I got horses or Stonehenge. I can only have one. I can't have both. And Roger puffed on his pipe a little and said, Stonehenge. So we got rid of the horses, and we filmed the scene on a soundstage with fake paper mache Stonehenges. That, to my mind, is a legitimate change, which sometimes you have to make an adaptation. It's triggered by budget. It's triggered by practical considerations of going from one thing to another. But on the same show, I was forced to make what I now rue as an illegitimate thing. That in television, they have this, and they have for decades, this high concept thing. When you're pitching a show, you got to be able to pitch it in a sentence to sell them what it is. Like my friend Michael Cassett had the example is you go in to pitch a new crime show, and you'd say, with a male-female team, and you'd say, he's the Pope, she's a chimp, they fight crime. And there it is, and then people go for it, the primate and the pontiff. So Twilight Zone was sold just with, we're bringing back this classic old Rod Serling show. But then one day, the guys at CBS, who is the network we were on, said, well, we don't have a description of what the Twilight Zone is. And our showrunner, Phil DeGuerre, was saying, well, you know what it is. It's the Twilight Zone. It's an anthology show every week. Well, every week is different. Well, yes, but we can't just say, well, here it is. Every week is different. What is it? What is the show? How do we describe it in a sentence? So Phil, had to appease them. So he said, it's an ordinary man finds himself in extraordinary circumstances and enters the Twilight Zone. And said, okay, good. We'll put that down. That's what it is. So that was officially the description of what our show was supposed to be. And we're filming Last Defender of Camelot, which begins in a scene where Sir Lancelot, as I say, has lived to the present day, and he's walking around London and he gets jumped by a couple thugs who are beating him up to take him to Morgan Le Fay. And the principal characters in it are Sir Lancelot, Morgan Le Fay, and Merlin, all of them around. And we're actually filming the thing. And we had just cast thug number 2, like in the last moment. And we're filming it, and suddenly we get a panic call from CBS. Oh, we got a big problem. We can't go ahead with this episode. We have to kill it. Why do you have to kill it? Well, it doesn't fit our template. Well, what do you mean it doesn't fit our template? There's no ordinary person in it. You got Sir Lancelot, Merlin, Morgan Le Fay. They're not ordinary. You got to put it. It's about an ordinary person who goes in. So I had to take thug number 2 and make him a major character. He doesn't do anything in the story. He just sort of bumps around, and he's ordinary. But that is the kind of thing that can happen to you that I don't think is a legitimate change.
So that's the perils of adaptation.
That is the perils of adaptation,
yeah.
And there will be, every time you think you've got it solved, it's not. Yeah.
So the final question from Gabriel is, what are your thoughts on the role of fantasy literature in contemporary culture, especially in terms of its ability to comment on current and social political issues? So does it always reach outside of itself to talk about what's happening now, or is fantasy something that...
Well, some of it does. It all depends on the writer, but I don't necessarily think it should. I mean, I know Tolkien himself hated people who were trying to read Lord of the Rings as allegory. He hated allegories. I'm not writing about World War I or World War II, and Sauron is not Hitler, and, stop trying to read this stuff into it. There are certainly... There are other people who don't agree with Tolkien and who do things that are...
Lewis, yeah.
Do things like that. Certainly you can read Animal Farm and say, well, yeah, he's writing about the Soviet Union there, and this pig is Stalin, and this other pig is Trotsky, and all of that. But I think fantasy is bigger than that. It doesn't have to comment on what's going on this week or this year or even this century. Fantasy is about universal human truths, about, love and life and faith or doubt or greed and lust, all of these basic human things that are different but still the same, whether it's the Middle Ages or 2024 or, ancient Rome or whatever. And those are the things that I like to talk about more.
Right, so we've had enough from Gabriel now, I think. So we're going to switch to some people from TikTok. And the next one is an interesting question for Abs from TikTok. Says, if you could change one thing about one of your books, what would you change and why? Maybe you don't want to change anything.
Oh, I don't know. I can probably change more than one thing. If I could change one thing about one of my books, I'd have them finished. I was, when I lived in Chicago, which was a long time ago now, we're going back to the 70s, I was part of a writers group. There were a number of us younger writers in there we were professionals, but we were just selling our first books and stories. But we also had in the group two of the legends of the fields, two older, more established writers, Algis Boudries, who was amazing, and Gene Wolfe. And Gene Wolfe, one of the great fantasy writers, he wrote a lot of great books, but his classic was the Shadow of the Torturer, a 4-book trilogy. So I sort of took a lesson from him there. And he would bring in every month when we met, he would bring another chunk of the Torturer books, and we'd read it and give him comments, most of which, frankly, he didn't need because he was better than us. But the thing I always envied about Gene was a very practical thing. Gene, as great as he was a part-time writer. He had a full-time job as an editor for a technical magazine, Plant Engineering, and they paid him a nice salary to be editor of Plant Engineering. And with that salary, he bought his home, and he sent his kids through college, and he supported his family. And then on weekends and nights, he wrote his books. And he wrote all 4 books of the Torturer series before he showed one to anyone. He didn't submit them to an editor, which is the way it usually did. He didn't get a contract and a deadline. He finished all 4 books, and of course, by the time he finished 4, remember it was supposed to be a trilogy. By the time he finished the 4th book, he was able to see the things in the first book that didn't really fit anymore, where the book had drifted away, where it had changed. So he was able to go back and revise the first book. And only when all 4 were finished did Gene submit the book, and and the series was bought and published. And I don't think I was alone in this. I kind of envied him the freedom to do that, but I knew even then I was not the editor of Plant Engineering magazine. I had no other salary. I lived entirely on the money that my stories and books earned. And if to write those 4 books took him like 6 years or something. I couldn't take 6 years off with no income. I would have wound up homeless or something like that. But there is something very liberating from an artistic point of view if you don't have to worry, if you happen to inherit a huge trust fund or a castle or something like that, and you can write your entire series without having to sell it, without having to worry about deadlines. That's something that I would envy, but I've never done that, and I never could done it even now. But believe it or not, I am not taking all that time to write Winds of Winter just because I think I'm Gene Wolfe now. I would love to have it finished years ago. But yeah, that's the big thing I think I would change.
Okay. So a question from Emma is, what advice do you have for someone only just starting to take their writing seriously? So now we're on to the advice for young writers questions, of which we got a bunch here.
Well, yeah, that's a question I get a lot, and it's a complicated answer. I think a lot of it comes down to the individual person and why they are writing, why they want to write or be a writer, and also what field they want to do. Do they want to write books? Do they want to write short stories? Do they want to get in television or film and be a screenwriter, maybe even be a screenwriter director, and all of those are kind of different paths. There are young writers I've met who are very, serious about the art of it, and I have something to say to the world. I have something to, impart, and that's a whole different thing than the people that I know who are saying, I want to pay my mortgage and maybe buy a house, who are, worried more about deadlines and worried about building a career, which is something different than, creating art and all that. And I've known all types. I mean, in January 14th of earlier this year, an old friend of mine named Howard Waldrop passed away. He was 2 years older than me. Howard was like my oldest friend in the field. We started corresponding to each other when I bought a comic book from him for a quarter in 1963. Brave and the Bold number 28, if any of you are comic book fans. First appearance of the Justice League of America. Howard thought he made a killing. He bought it for a dime, sold it to me for a quarter. I think it's worth like $30,000 now. But Howard wrote short stories. He did write 2 novels during his career. Well, novel and a half. One was a collaboration. But mostly he wrote short stories. He wrote the most incredible short stories that you could ever see. No one else could ever write the short story. He was half crazy. He knew everything about popular culture, and he knew classical culture, and he came up with these weird-ass ideas and wrote these little short stories that would sell, and many of them he won awards. He won a Nebula Award for one of his stories. He won the World Fantasy Award for another. He won a Lifetime Achievement Award by the World Fantasy. But he lived his entire life on the edge of poverty. You know, he lived in these grungy little rooms in Austin, Texas, and for months he ate nothing but top ramen noodles. And but his art, his stories were what mattered to him. And you know, he would be offered. I mean, at one point back in the 70s, he was offered a chance to write a Star Trek novel, and you know, it would have paid him more than 3 years of his short story writing, but he wasn't interested in doing Star Trek. He was doing his own weird little things, and he left behind him an incredible list of like 100 short stories. I'm making some of them into little short films now, and we're releasing them to film festivals. Howard is one kind of guy, though. But then you know other people who they want to build a career, and there's nothing wrong with that. I certainly built my career. And you don't want to write short stories if you're trying to build a career, maybe a few in the beginning, so if you can win a few awards and get your name out there, that's good. That worked for me. It used to work back in the 70s, 80s. I'm not sure it works anymore. But there are whole different techniques for how to make yourself work. When I got that question, I used to talk about how my career developed from my first story in 71. But that advice no longer works. The world has changed too much. The internet and things like that have changed. I know, do any of you know who John Scalzi is, the science fiction writer? Very successful science fiction writer. He sells his books, 10 novels for $5 million, things like that. He just had another sale like that, he announced. John broke in, he was a journalist, but he had a blog that a lot of people read, and he started publishing a science fiction story called Old Man's War on his blog, a free chapter every month or something like that. And it became very popular, and an editor from Tor Books heard that it was popular, and he looked it up. He said, oh, this is really good. And he contacted John, and he bought it, and they instead of giving it away, Tor started publishing it, and that book was very successful, and all of John's later success came from that. And I had John at my theater in Santa Fe, and I was interviewing him, much like this, and I said, the way you broke in with writing your book and putting it for free on your blog, it worked for you, but there's a lot of people who are trying that, and they're putting it little fragments on their blog, and no one is paying any attention to them. They're not getting editors reading them and reaching out and buying them. So why did it work for you, and is it not working for other people? And John said, well, before I did that with Old Man's War, I had a pretty popular presence blogging online anyway. And at one point, I wrapped bacon around my cat, and it went viral. Millions of people thought it was really, really funny, and they passed it to all their friends. So when I wrote Old Man's War and I put it up, it became, oh, the guy who put bacon around the cat has written a novel. Let's go check it out. So
that is fantastic advice. So maybe don't try this at home, I think.
But you can't do that anymore because he's done that now. So
it had to be some other well-known food substance. I think we've got time for maybe one more writer question, and I'm going to stick together some from the people from the Oxford Writers' House. Who are your greatest literary idols, and what do you most admire about their work? What should people be reading?
Well, I mean, we're here at Oxford, so I first got to mention Tolkien, first of all. Yeah, Tolkien had an enormous impact on me. I was already reading, you know, as I said, I started out reading comic books. But at one point, when I was like 11, a friend of my mother's gave me a hardcover science fiction book, Robert A. Heinlein's Have Space It Will Travel. And a great book, and I read that, and suddenly, from my $1 a week allowance, I was buying a 35-cent paperback and fewer comic books. And then I got into science fiction. And then there was an anthology that I came on that was edited by Sprague de Camp, Swords and Sorcery, and it was a fantasy anthology. It wasn't as popular, but it had Robert E. Howard stories in it, Conan stories. It had Fritz Leiber stories, Falbert and the Grey Mouser. It had stories by about Jirel of Jewry by C.L. Moore, the female Sword and Sorcery. And that got me really interested in that, and through that I heard about Tolkien. And then I also, on a horror anthology, encountered Lovecraft. So the three things that I, you know, wound up writing most were in fantasy, Tolkien, but also Fritz Leiber and Robert E. Howard. In science fiction, definitely Heinlein. He was a giant. He was above everybody else. But I got into all the rest later. Asimov and Jerry Saul and you know, Eric Frank Russell. There were tons of them. And for horror, Lovecraft. There was no one like Lovecraft. Those were huge influences on me. And of course, later when I was getting into literature courses, I was reading the classics of literature. I think the one that had the most impact on me was F. Scott Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby.
Oh, really?
Maybe because I was just at that time in my... There are certain books you have to read at the right time, you know? And I had just broken up with my college girlfriend, so it's the perfect time to read The Great Gatsby.
For sure.
So there was that one. Also Dickens. I liked a lot of Dickens, although in those cases it was... I fell in love with the movies first. Christmas Carol, which I watch. Every Christmas I watch The Christmas Carol. And since there are like 27 different versions, I usually watch it 8 times and compare which ones are good and which ones are horrible. And they all had an influence on me. But still, Tolkien most of all. One of the real judgments of a power of a book is how often you reread it, because there are things that are only apparent on the second read or the third read, and I reread Lord of the Rings every few years.
That's a great recommendation. I think now we've probably got to the point where we should move over to asking some of our very patient audience if they have any questions. So it's roving mic time. And a lot of hands going up. But yet no mic.
Well, I don't know if there's a mic or not. If you just speak loudly, I can give it a crack.
Can I ask which of your characters is your favorite? Why is it the Great and Powerful Turtle?
What?
Which of your characters is your favorite, and why is it?
Why is it the Great and Powerful Turtle?
Why is it the great and powerful turtle? Okay. Oh, now we found the microphone.
That's the most autobiographical character I've ever invented. So he's sort of me, except I don't have superpowers, which is a pity. But the great and powerful turtle, Tom Tudbury, lives in the projects in Bayonne, New Jersey, where I actually lived for most of my life till I went away to college. And I drew on him there. You know, I think all characters that you're writing from inside their head, you're writing their viewpoint, are autobiographical to some degree, or need to be autobiographical to some degree. One of the things when I was starting to write as a kid that I was troubled by, because I didn't really understand it, was the advice you'd get of write what you know. I hated that advice because I didn't know much at all. I mean, we didn't have any money. We didn't even have a car. We lived in the projects. I never went anywhere. I was, a projects kid going to a public school, and what the hell did I know? I didn't want to write books about projects kids going to public school in Bayonne, New Jersey. Oh, I finally did with the turtle. But I finally got to the true understanding, I think, of what that means, write what you know, and it's write what you know in your heart and your mind and your spirit. It doesn't matter. Yes, I've never been a dwarf like Tyrion, and I've never been a king or an 8-year-old girl or any of these things, but I could imagine some of the things, and other things I could research about, ask people who had been through it to tell me things, or read books by other people. And there was always the idea of the spirit and the thought and your yearning, and that what makes those characters come alive. So that's what I think write what you know means. It doesn't mean, if your father is a baker, that you can only write about bakers. Don't believe that.
Vital advice. Right, we've got a question from over here.
Hi, it's a pleasure to meet you. So I have one question. So you mentioned in several interviews that you're a gardener, like not a literal gardener, but like in terms of writing stories, right? Instead of an architect.
Instead of what?
So you're a gardener instead of an architect.
A gardener versus an architect.
Yes. So my question is, when you develop stories, you create atmosphere, obviously, especially when you write about like feasts and everything, which you do a lot. And this is as much part of a story as plot, right? So my question is, when you start writing your story, as you go along and explode on the way, how do you keep the balance with maintaining conflict and kind of doing what the plot demands of you?
Well, I mean, yes, what she's mentioning is the distinction I made in many past things about there are two types of writers. The architect who plans a whole novel in advance, just like an architect drawing a blueprint for a house. He knows what the roof is and what the floor is and how many floors there's going to be and where the electrical wires are going to run and all that. While the gardener just sort of plants a seed and waters it and lets it grow. And I, like Tolkien, is much more of a gardener. But sometimes you don't know. I mean, you're trying to figure it out, and the thing that comes up from your gardening is a weed, and at some point you have to realize that and pull it out, or take a different direction. And I think the architects in some ways have an easier plan once they have the blueprints down, but I can't write that way. I never have been able to. Every writer's a little different, and if you had a whole series of classes, writers up here, and asked the same questions, you probably get different answers. I mean, it's a pity that Mr. Pullman wasn't able to make it. It would have been interesting to compare, his methods.
Is he an architect or a gardener?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. My guess is architect, actually, but there you are. That's when you build a lot of worlds.
Yeah.
Right, next question. Yeah.
Hello, it's a pleasure to meet you. I would like to ask this. We had recently an interview with Elio and Linda, which co-authored World of Ice and Fire on our podcast, which is the Italian Song of Ice and Fire podcast. And we talked about fame. So I would like to know, how did the great fame that you achieved with your books and also with the television adaptations influence your work? How did you handle it? Was it an aid or was it an obstacle for you, for your writing? Thank you very much.
You got it in anyway.
Was the adaptation one?
It's the question of whether fame has helped or been a
fame.
hindrance. Yeah. You don't have to answer if you don't want to.
Well, that's a long question here. I think when you're young and starting out, and especially if you're coming from a background that isn't one of wealth or money or thought, you dream of fame and fortune and someday achieving it. Bill Murray, the comedian, was once asked about that, and he said, yes, we all dream of fame and fortune. Try just fortune first. Fame is definitely a double-edged sword. I'm not going to say it's not nice. I get to meet some wonderful people. Total strangers come up to me on the street and or in restaurants or things like that. I get a good turnout. And also, it happened to me relatively late in my life. I mean, I sold my first short story when I was 21 years old and had a certain amount of fame within a little puddle of science fiction right in the beginning, but I only came into play at science fiction conventions. I could go to a science fiction convention and put on my name badge, and people would ask for my autograph, and I would be on panels and stuff like that. And then I could take it off, and I could go to McDonald's and have a cheeseburger, and nobody would pay any attention to me. But that's gone now, and there were good things and bad things about it. The fortune, yes, the fortune is very good. The fame is can be very nice. People say very nice things, but you can't. I mean, in the old days, I could take off the badge and be in McDonald's. I can't turn it off anymore. It's everywhere, and you know, I have my loyal minion here, Sid, who is much sterner and more frightening than me, and can chase away people. Perfectly nice people, but sometimes there's so many of them, you know? You sit in a restaurant and someone comes up to you and says, "I don't mean to interrupt your dinner, but,
But you are.
I'm going to interrupt your dinner." And then there's someone else, and then there's someone else, and then there's someone else. So it can be a lot, but I think it's more good than bad, and you just got to, I mean, it comes with the territory. So I probably did make a mistake, though. When we got Game of Thrones going for the TV show, we were using a lot of unknown actors. The best known was Sean Bean, who we were going to kill, of course. They did a lot of publicity with me because I was a pretty well-known writer, and that really got my face out there, which wasn't necessarily the greatest thing in the world, but whatever. You know, Stephen King, who I know a little bit, told me once, he said, you know, the worst mistake I ever made was doing that credit card commercial where, you know, before that, you may have seen his picture on the back of his book, but after he did that American Express commercial back in the 80s, you may not know who I am, but I've scared you many a time, and then there he is, and you see his name. Then everybody in the world knew what Stephen King looked like, and, you know, that changed his life fundamentally, as the fame of mine has changed mine.
So that's a lesson for anybody who's going to get famous here. I think we've got time for just one more question.
Hello. I want to start by saying thank you for your work. And you were talking about adaptations earlier, and I was wondering if you've ever thought about creating a Song of Ice and Fire animated series. You've done loads of books with illustrations, and also, like, a lot of people I'm sure have watched manga and, I mean, watched anime and read manga, and as they would know, like, manga and anime, they follow the adaptation very literally. They don't change a lot of things. And obviously, you've made loads of illustration books. I've got one with me now. Like, surely you could turn that into an animated version of A Song of Ice and Fire, and every episode could be like a POV chapter.
Well, in 2007, HBO purchased the film and television rights to A Song of Ice and Fire and to The World of Westeros from me. So, and that includes animation. So from 2007, HBO has owned those rights. But we are developing other shows. I mean, right now we have House of Dragon is just completing its second season, and they've started work on a third season. In Belfast right now, we are filming The Hedge Knight, the first of the Duncan Egg stories. 6 episodes, and that's live action. But in addition to that, we are developing 7 other shows set in various parts of Westeros. 3 of them are live action, and 4 of them are animated shows. If they're made. Now, there's no guarantee they'll be made. I mean, the way television works, you work for a year or 2 years or whatever. You develop a show, you write treatments, you get notes, you write screenplays, you get more notes, and eventually they said, we'll make it, we won't make it. But some of the animated shows, I think, would be really, really good. I mean, one of the shows we've been working on for a couple years is a prequel about the sea snake, Corlys Valerian, and his 9 epic voyages. He was like the Magellan of Westeros, and we call it 9 Voyages, or the sea snake. And we developed that as live action for a couple of years, and then we realized that there's no way that we could ever afford to make it live action. It all takes place at sea, and he visits a different city every week, and so we'd have to be creating Karth and Bravos and Ib and all, whatever, but we could do it animated, so we're now developing that to be an animated show if we can get it going.
Okay, we're going to have to stop there, I
I've
think.
got one quick question about Rhaegar Targaryen. I think he's very misunderstood.
No follow-up questions, I'm sorry, no hogging the microphone, because it's time for April to give us the closing remarks.
Thank you all for that brilliant discussion. Shortly we'll be having our book signing, so apart from finding us on social media and keeping a lookout for our new creative podcast, which we'll be publishing this year, the best way you can support the Oxford Writers' House tonight is to pick up a copy of our very first publication, Peregrine's Curious Collection. This book was written by school children from Oxfordshire as part of our schools-wide writing competition. At the time of authorship, the writers of this collection were between the ages of 8 and 11. As far as we know, this is Oxford's first book written by young readers for young readers. The stories have been hand-illustrated lovingly by artists here and abroad, and the publication team gave special attention to formatting the stories to be read by young people, in particular, any young person who struggles with reading difficulties in school. The book would make an ideal gift for readers between the ages of 6 and 10. On behalf of the young authors who are part of our project, I would like to call Innocent Adrian to accept his copy of the book. Congratulations, Innocent, on this milestone. We hope you continue to dream and write brilliant stories. Before we start the book signing, there's another special audience member I would like to invite to come up to accept a pre-signed book. I received an email from this audience member's father and was very moved by it. Here's part of what he wrote to us. Up to 2 years ago, my son struggled with reading and never read for pleasure. Out of desperation, at an airport bookshop in Dublin, I dared him that I would buy him any book on display as long as he could read it. He called my bluff and picked up the thickest thing he could find, a Game of Thrones, read it cover to cover, and is now busily plowing his way through the series. He's immersed in this world, and it has got him reading, and he now is even working some hours voluntarily at the library. Please can Jamie Cottrell come accept his pre-signed copy? Well done, Jamie. We hope you will continue to read many more books for pleasure and maybe even write your own. Shortly, we will ask that you please queue for the signatures. We want to make sure that everyone receives a signature. So if you could move through the signature process swiftly and respectfully, we appreciate this. Thank you again for coming.